What if the true power of ancient China wasn't found in the emperor's sword, but in a quiet brushstroke on a bamboo slip? Here at Whisper Sleep Histories, we believe the most enduring stories aren't always the loudest. So if you enjoy slow journeys through the forgotten corners of history, where even a tax ledger can reveal the soul of an empire, make sure to subscribe, and stay with us until the end of this video. Because tonight, we're tracing the tale of bureaucracy, grain, and an unexpectedly thrilling world of taxes. Let us drift, if only for a moment, away from the tales we think we know. The ones filled with clashing armies and emperors' decrees, with golden dragons circling the heavens and mandarins debating beneath painted screens. Let us pause the grand historical stage and instead, very gently, open the creaking door to a back office in a provincial capital, somewhere deep in ancient China. Inside, we find no warriors, no courtly intrigues, and no poets reciting verses under the moon. What we find instead is silence. Dust. A slow breath. A table. A brush. And a man, tired, focused, and scribbling, line after line, onto slips of polished bamboo. He is not recording poetry. He is not composing strategy. He is not writing to a loved one. He is recording tax. That, dear listener, is where this story begins. Not with a battle or a coronation, but with a ledger. With numbers. With quotas. With the dull hum of civil life, the part of history that most would rather skip. And yet, it is this part, this infinitely tedious world of paperwork and provincial accounting, that held the great empires of China together. Quietly. Faithfully. Relentlessly. Long before the Great Wall traced its winding spine across the northern mountains, before silk crossed desert sands and made its way into Roman hands, and long before Confucianism nestled itself into the very marrow of governance, there was a simpler concern. How, in a land so vast, with people so many, and seasons so precariously uncertain, how do you make sure the empire eats? How do you ensure its armies are fed? That roads are maintained, canals dredged, temples rebuilt, and court salaries paid? The answer, like a whispered truth in a room full of orators, was this: taxes. Taxes, that deeply human invention. The soft tyranny of percentages. The art of asking people to give what they have, so that others, often far away, may decide what to do with it. It is an old art. And in China, it became a science. In the ancient villages dotting the Lus Plateau, in the rice paddies of the south, in the dusty border towns where nomads traded salt for grain, life was marked by rhythms. The rising of the sun, the planting of seeds, the coming of the rains. But there was another rhythm too, less natural, more imposed. It came with the arrival of the tax official, with his records and measurements, with his quiet calculations and his not-so-quiet expectations. Crops could fail, rivers could flood, but the tax would still arrive. Slowly. Surely. Like the turning of a great wheel. You may think this sounds unremarkable. And you would be right. Remarkably unremarkable. But therein lies the secret. For it was this cycle, repeated again and again across thousands of villages and over thousands of years, that formed the invisible skeleton of Chinese civilization. If emperors were the brain and armies the muscle, taxes were the bone, silent, unglamorous, but holding everything in place. Consider this: the Shang dynasty, whose bronze vessels now reside in museums and textbooks alike, depended not only on ritual and warfare but on extracting goods from vassals, grain, cattle, jade. These were not offered freely. They were required, counted, expected. The records of these transactions, etched onto oracle bones, are among the earliest written Chinese. That's right. One of the first things Chinese writing was used for, was taxes. And this, perhaps, is where we begin to see the shape of something larger. That the origins of writing, of record-keeping, of organized governance itself, are all intimately tied to the need to track who owes what. That literacy, in its infancy, was not the domain of poets but of clerks. Move forward a few centuries, and the Zhou dynasty continues this tradition, refining the feudal system into a more structured hierarchy. Kings grant land, but that land comes with obligations of loyalty, yes, but more importantly, obligations of yield. It is the measure of what you return, not what you possess, that determines your worth to the center. The Zhou kings, with their celestial mandate and noble lineages, relied on grain reports. One could lose favor, land, or life not through rebellion, but through misreporting the barley harvest. It may be tempting to think that such systems were merely exploitative, a tool for the rich to burden the poor. And indeed, there is truth in that. But they were also deeply logistical enterprises. Administering an empire, especially one as geographically and culturally diverse as China, required more than charisma. It required paper trails. Or rather, in those early days, trails of string-bound bamboo slips or silk scrolls, inked by weary scribes with steady hands. To understand ancient Chinese tax codes is to understand a mindset. Not of glory, but of endurance. Not of conquest, but of stability. Where the ultimate goal was not victory, but balance. A good dynasty, it was said, was not one that expanded fastest, but one that could maintain the proper grain reserve ratio over 20 harvests. This was wisdom not found on the battlefield, but in a backroom archive, where old records were kept in careful order. And so, the scribes, often anonymous, often underpaid, became the true sentinels of civilization. It was they who tracked the yield, who tallied the headcount, who recalculated quotas when a flood destroyed 3 provinces' worth of wheat. It was they who noticed when a village's output dropped for 3 consecutive years, or when a distant official reported suspiciously round numbers. They were not heroes. They were bureaucrats. But they were necessary. You see, ancient China was not built all at once. It was not built only by the sword or the plow. It was built, day by day, by the careful regulation of obligations. And the most enduring obligations were financial. Tribute may come and go, dynasties may rise and fall, but taxes, like a river bending around stone, always found a way. The idea of taxation in ancient China, then, was not merely economic, it was cosmological. The emperor was the son of heaven, yes, but heaven demanded order. That meant fields surveyed, people counted, and goods distributed in accordance with both need and law. To fail in taxation was not only a civil error, it was a disruption of the natural order. A miscounted bushel could, in theory, offend the heavens. And in a society where harmony was paramount, that was no small thing. Over time, as dynasties came and went, the systems grew more elaborate. The Qin brought standardization, the Han introduced detailed household registries, the Tang experimented with equitable distribution, and the Song layered it all with commercial levies and infrastructural bonds. Each age tweaked the code, reformatted the tables, and reinterpreted what it meant to contribute. But all of them, every dynasty, reformer, and regent, returned to the same basic concern: how do you know what the people have, and how do you ensure they part with just enough of it to keep the empire breathing? This, then, is the quiet drama of our story. Not wars, but spreadsheets. Not thrones, but tallies. It is the story of how ancient China, a civilization of poets and warriors, monks and merchants, kept itself stitched together not only by faith or fear, but by math. By measuring. By monitoring. By paperwork. And though we may chuckle at the dryness of it, or yawn at the tedium of rice quotas and pig taxes, let us not forget, it is often the boring things that last. The spectacular tends to burn bright and vanish. But the ledger? The ledger endures. Quietly. Undramatically. Forever. So as we continue our slow descent into the tangled, ink-stained world of ancient Chinese tax systems, let us remember that sometimes, in the dustiest corners of history, among the forgotten clerks and brittle scrolls, we find the real shape of empires. It may not be thrilling. But it is, enduringly boring. And that, dear listener, is why we begin here. Before tax codes came to resemble the dense bureaucratic forests of later dynasties, before they were bound up in detailed household registers and tabulated spreadsheets of millet, there was a beginning. And, as it happens with many beginnings, it was both simpler and stranger than we might expect. Let us go back, further back, to a time before paper, before coins, even before the unifying rhythms of Confucian thought. Let us travel, slowly and with no real hurry, to the age of the Shang and Zhou. The Shang dynasty, resting somewhere between legend and archaeology, is often remembered for its oracle bones, its bronze ritual vessels, and its kings who consulted the spirit world before launching any meaningful endeavor. But among the many concerns of these early rulers, reign, war, ancestors, there was another persistent theme. A question more earthly, more tedious. How do you collect what you need from those who have it? In other words, how do you tax your people? It is perhaps appropriate that one of the earliest known uses of Chinese writing was not poetry or myth, but bookkeeping. Many of the divinations etched onto turtle shells and ox scapulae were not purely spiritual inquiries, but recorded assessments, tributes received, livestock counted, harvests weighed. The Shang kings may have believed in divine signs, but they also believed in inventory. There were records of how many sheep were delivered by this village, how many jars of millet by that one, and even how many ritual objects were cast from bronze mined by such and such a clan. For all their mysticism, the Shang were, at heart, pragmatic. Their system was not yet what we might call a tax code. It had no formalized brackets, no percentages carved in stone. But it did have expectations. Obligations. A village under Shang control was expected to offer up a portion of its resources, not just food, but labor, metals, textiles. These offerings were called gong, and while they might be presented in the language of ritual tribute, they were, effectively, taxes. A kind of sacred tax, perhaps. But a tax nonetheless. And, like all taxes, they came with tension. The farther a village lay from the central authority, the more likely it was to delay or dispute its tribute. In times of drought or famine, the offerings grew thinner, and complaints thicker. There were no tax auditors in the modern sense, but there were inspectors, appointed or dispatched from the royal court, who traveled with ledgers and sharp eyes. Their job was not merely to collect, but to observe. To ensure that a village had not conveniently forgotten to mention a new field of barley, or a recent litter of pigs. The Shang taxation structure, if we may call it that, functioned more as a network of negotiated tribute than a formalized system. It was flexible, and that flexibility was both a strength and a weakness. It allowed local leaders to interpret their obligations with a certain creativity. But it also meant that compliance relied heavily on personal loyalty, family alliances, and ritual respect, qualities which, while noble-sounding, often failed to survive under pressure. And so we drift forward, gently, into the Zhou period. If the Shang were the mystic administrators, the Zhou were the philosophical reformers. Their arrival brought with it not just new kings, but new ideas, particularly around the idea of order. The Zhou did not simply conquer the Shang, they inherited and reinterpreted their systems. They saw in the world a natural hierarchy, heaven above, earth below, and between them, humanity arranged in harmonious levels. It was a beautiful thought. And, more importantly, it was administratively useful. The Zhou dynasty is often described as feudal, though the term, imported from European history, does not quite capture the full texture of what the Zhou were doing. Rather than a pyramid of knights and lords, the Zhou developed a latticework of kin-based appointments. Royal family members and trusted allies were granted parcels of land, known as fiefs, in exchange for loyalty, military support, and, most significantly, tribute. This tribute was the Zhou version of tax. It was more structured than the Shang system, but still deeply embedded in personal relationships. A duke ruling over a distant territory was expected to send regular shipments of grain, animals, cloth, and occasionally troops, back to the Zhou king. These payments were not optional, but they were not yet enforced by an impersonal bureaucracy. Rather, they functioned within a web of duties, ritual ceremonies, ancestral worship, and the unspoken understanding that to fail one's tribute was to fail one's ancestors. And in Zhou society, that was a rather serious breach. But slowly, as the generations rolled on, this tribute began to transform. The ritual became routine. The offerings, once symbolic gestures of fealty, were increasingly seen as obligations tied to land ownership. If you farmed land granted by the king, you owed the king a portion of what that land produced. It was, in effect, rent. And from that idea, a simple portioning of agricultural yield, grew the foundation of all later Chinese tax systems. Of course, the Zhou rulers were not content to let such matters float in the air. They began to codify them. Not in the way we might recognize from later dynasties, with written tax laws and inspectors and annual audits. But they did begin to structure obligations into clearer terms. Fiefs were categorized. Crops were counted. Labor obligations were defined in greater detail. The system was far from standardized, but the idea of taxation as a recurring, quantifiable responsibility had taken root. This slow shift, from ritual tribute to administrative tax, is one of the quiet revolutions of early Chinese governance. It did not involve bloodshed. It did not inspire epics. But it changed the very structure of power. Because once a ruler began to expect a precise amount of millet from a particular region, and once that amount could be tracked over time, then governance itself began to revolve not around charisma or lineage, but around calculation. And with calculation came bureaucracy. Not in the modern sense, there were no ministries of finance yet, but in the embryonic sense. There were records to be kept. Messengers to deliver data. Clerks to tally numbers. Officials to reconcile what was owed with what was received. Slowly, very slowly, the empire began to lean more on paper, well, bamboo, and less on faith. We must remember, though, that these early systems were still deeply human. There were no calculators, no spreadsheets, no algorithms. Everything was done by hand, by memory, by habit. A tax clerk in the Western Zhou period was more likely to be someone's nephew than a trained accountant. And yet, the very fact that such roles existed at all, that someone, somewhere, was responsible for tallying the annual yield of barley from a village of 200 people, speaks to the growing complexity of the system. Of course, no system is without its quirks. The Zhou records, such as they survive, reveal as much inconsistency as they do structure. Different regions interpreted their obligations differently. Some counted labor as equivalent to grain. Others offered silk instead of wheat. One province might measure land in paces, another in furrows. There was no national standard of weights or currency. And yet, amidst this chaos, the idea held, that land granted by the ruler must return something. Not out of gratitude. Not out of love. But out of obligation. It is easy to underestimate how revolutionary this was. The idea that land should be tied to yield, and that yield should be tied to a central authority, is not intuitive. In many ancient societies, rulers lived by conquest, by spoils, by the unpredictable bounty of war. But in Zhou China, the emphasis began to shift toward sustainability. Stability. A slow, predictable cycle of giving and receiving. Of planting and collecting. Of taxing and redistributing. And so, the Zhou kings, at least in theory, became not just warriors or priests, but managers. Their success was judged not merely by how many rivals they defeated, but by how well they maintained the flow of resources. Did the granaries fill each autumn? Were the road crews sufficiently staffed? Did the tribute arrive from the Western territories on time, in the proper quantities, with the correct seals? These were the questions that now mattered. Not because they were exciting, but because they were essential. The bureaucracy, of course, lagged behind the ideal. Corruption was common. Fiefs became hereditary, and some local lords began to treat their taxes as voluntary gestures rather than obligations. In time, the authority of the central Zhou court weakened, and the spring and autumn period began, a time of fracturing, decentralization, and low-level chaos. But even as the Zhou court lost its teeth, the idea of taxation remained. It had sunk in too deep. Local rulers, even as they broke from the center, still collected grain. Still counted heads. Still expected their peasants to deliver a portion of their produce each year. By the end of the Zhou period, China was no longer a singular empire but a mosaic of competing states, each with their own mini-tax systems, their own ledgers, their own idea of what constituted fair tribute. But the core structure, the agricultural tax, the labor levy, the census, remained strikingly consistent. It was as if the Zhou had planted a seed so thoroughly that even when their tree withered, its roots pushed up new shoots in every direction. Thus, the transition from Shang to Zhou is not simply the story of one dynasty replacing another. It is the story of how tribute evolved into tax. How obligation transformed from a ritual to a record. How the farmer in the field, the clerk in the hall, and the noble in the palace were slowly woven into a single system, uneven, imperfect, but resilient. And so, when we speak of ancient Chinese tax codes, we must begin here, not with formulas or laws, but with ideas. With a culture that came to see taxation not as theft or tyranny, but as a natural rhythm. A way to participate in the cosmic order. A duty, like planting rice or honoring one's elders. It was not glamorous. It was not beloved. But it was accepted. And from that acceptance grew an empire. Let us now drift gently into one of the most misunderstood, most fearsome, and, at least for our purposes, most efficient dynasties in all of Chinese history, the Qin. You may already be picturing the first emperor, chin lifted, eyes narrowed, gazing over rows of terracotta warriors in grim silence. Or perhaps you imagine the vast construction of the early Great Wall, or the burning of books, or the standardization of script, weights, and measures. And yes, all of those things did happen, more or less. But beneath those more dramatic flourishes, there was something quieter at work. Something colder. More systematic. And certainly, more bureaucratic. The Qin dynasty, in its brief, burning moment on the historical stage, gave China something it had never fully experienced before: centralized taxation, rigid enforcement, and a terrifying love of paperwork. To understand the Qin approach to taxation, one must understand what came before it. The Zhou world, as we've seen, was one of looseness, of delegated power, of tribute tangled in personal bonds and kinship networks. Taxes, in that time, were something like obligations between lords and kings, still infused with ritual, respect, and regional variety. But the Qin had no patience for such ambiguity. Emerging from the western state of Qin during the chaotic warring states period, they were shaped by competition. It was a time when no dynasty reigned supreme, and no province could afford to be inefficient. Among the dozens of warring states, it was the Qin who learned, slowly and then all at once, that success lay not in pageantry, but in precision. And so they embraced the one ideology perfectly suited to this sharp new world: legalism. Legalism, unlike Confucianism or Taoism, was not interested in harmony or mystery. It was interested in rules. In control. In cause and effect. A well-run state, it claimed, was one where laws were clear, punishments swift, and rewards rare. And most of all, it demanded that all things, people, grain, land, livestock, be counted. Tallied. Reported. So that the ruler might know, with unnerving accuracy, exactly what he governed. And thus, when Qin Shi Huang, formerly the king of Qin, unified China in 221 BCE and declared himself the first emperor, he set about transforming a fractured, multi-lorded landscape into a single administrative organism. It was not just a matter of conquering territory, it was about standardizing it. And nothing quite standardizes like a tax ledger. Gone were the varying systems of weights and measures that had plagued interregional trade and tribute. The Qin introduced a unified system of measurement, the same units for grain, for land, for distance. Gone too were the dozens of regional scripts. Instead, a standardized form of Chinese writing was enforced, so that officials across the realm could read and write the same records, in the same form. A unified script, not for poetry, but for taxation. The backbone of the Qin tax system was land and labor. Every household was expected to register, accurately, with the government. There were no exceptions. These registrations, or household registers, were then used to calculate tax obligations. Each family's land was surveyed, their members counted, and their ability to work assessed. The more land you held, the more you owed. The more adults in your household, the more labor you were expected to contribute. This labor tax, corvée, was not a vague duty. It was clearly scheduled. A certain number of days per year, each eligible man was required to work for the state. This might include building roads, canals, fortifications, or even sections of the Great Wall. And, as with all things Qin, failure to show up, or to perform adequately, was met not with a warning, but with severe punishment. The legalist state did not coddle. But it was not all labor. There were also taxes in kind. That is to say, taxes paid in goods, grain, cloth, animals. These taxes were collected with unnerving efficiency. Officials at each level of administration, village, district, commandery, were tasked with enforcing quotas. There were no private arrangements, no noble exemptions, no special considerations. The tax code applied to everyone. In theory, even the officials themselves were subject to the same rules they enforced. What made this system function, at least temporarily, was its obsession with records. The Qin bureaucracy required an immense amount of paperwork. Or rather, bamboo work. Documents had to be copied, reported, and sent up the chain. Local magistrates recorded household data. Regional governors compiled them into reports. The central government reviewed, compared, and redistributed based on need, or punishment. These were not suggestions. Every number mattered. If an official misreported figures, whether intentionally or by incompetence, the penalties could include demotion, imprisonment, or execution. There was a kind of cold purity to the Qin system. It did not ask for devotion. Only obedience. But in this coldness, there was also clarity. For the first time, China was taxed not as a patchwork of local customs, but as a single entity. Farmers across vast distances were expected to follow the same rules. Grain flowed into centralized granaries, stored for future use or emergencies. Labor projects, no matter how ambitious, could be planned with the precision of available manpower. The system, brutal as it was, worked. And yet, it did not last. Because while the Qin system achieved a degree of order that had never been seen before, it did so at the cost of resentment. The tax burden was heavy. The labor demands relentless. The surveillance unending. A farmer who had once bartered tribute with a local lord now found himself answering to faceless officials, with no room for negotiation. A young man who might have spent his life tending pigs now found himself drafted to move stones for a 1,000-mile road, or worse, a wall built to keep out invisible enemies. The system was efficient. But it had no heart. And as the years passed, that absence grew unbearable. Within a decade of Qin Shi Huang's death, the dynasty began to collapse under the weight of its own strictness. Rebellions flared. Local leaders, once cowed, began to assert independence. The tightly wound gears of administration jammed, cracked, and finally burst. By 206 BCE, the Qin were gone. Their dream of a legalist empire vanished almost as quickly as it had arisen. And yet, this is where the story becomes quietly strange. The system they built did not vanish. Not really. The Han dynasty, which rose in the Qin's ashes, rejected legalism in name, embracing Confucian ideals of benevolence and moral governance. But in practice, they kept many of the Qin's administrative innovations. Standardized weights. Household registration. Land surveys. Grain quotas. The Qin had shown what was possible. And the Han, ever practical, adopted what worked. In this way, the Qin dynasty, short-lived though it was, left behind a legacy not of philosophy or art, but of ledgers. Of numbers. Of processes. Of a belief that an empire could be managed, not just ruled. And that the management of people, through records, schedules, and quotas, was itself a form of power. So let us pause, just for a moment, and consider the image of a Qin administrator, sitting alone at dusk. The lantern glows faintly. He dips his brush. He copies a report from one bamboo slip to another. The wind scratches against the window. Outside, somewhere, a farmer hauls grain to the district storehouse, unpaid but not unwilling, because this is simply how it is. The emperor does not see him. The emperor does not need to. The system sees him. The ledger knows. It is not a romantic vision. But it is a compelling one. And in the end, perhaps that is the quiet lesson of the Qin. That power, in its most enduring form, is not always loud. Sometimes it is silent. Sometimes it is made of columns and rows. Of fields surveyed. Of heads counted. Of grain measured to the last bushel. It may not be inspiring. But it is efficient. Let us now slip gently into the Han dynasty. Not with the crash of rebellion or the echo of military drums, but with the soft shuffle of silk slippers down a government corridor, the slow unrolling of a bamboo scroll, and the careful exhalation of an aging official adjusting the records of a rural district's millet yield. The Han, following the cold rigidity of the Qin, did not so much reinvent the imperial machine as ease into it. If the Qin were a clenched fist, the Han were an open palm, just as firm, but less visibly so. Their genius, if we can call it that, lay not in dramatic invention, but in institutional relaxation. Bureaucracy, in the Han, did not disappear. It simply got comfortable. To understand Han taxation, one must first understand what the Han inherited, and what they chose, quite deliberately, to keep. When Liu Bang, a commoner turned warlord, rose from the ashes of Qin collapse to found the Han in 206 BCE, he positioned himself as a man of the people. He denounced the harshness of legalism, embraced Confucian ideals of benevolent rule, and promised lighter burdens for the weary peasantry. But promising and delivering are, as ever, two different things. The machinery of the Qin, its household registers, land surveys, tax quotas, and administrative chains, was simply too useful to discard. And so, the Han kept it. They sanded off the rough edges, replaced draconian punishments with warnings or moral lectures, and swapped out legalist slogans for Confucian proverbs. But behind the moral philosophy and gentle words, the structure remained remarkably intact. The empire was still counted, recorded, and taxed. Only now, it smiled while doing so. Let us begin with the household register. In Han China, every family was required to submit an annual report of sorts, names, ages, occupations, land holdings, livestock, and the number of adult males eligible for labor or military service. These registers, collected at the village level and compiled upward through the administrative hierarchy, formed the backbone of the Han state's knowledge. They were not perfect, of course, some families underreported, others moved without permission, but they allowed the central government to maintain a fairly accurate sense of who owed what and where. From these registers came tax assignments. The Han system relied primarily on two forms of tax, a land tax and a poll tax. The land tax, unsurprisingly, was based on the amount of cultivated land a household possessed. Usually paid in grain, it represented a modest but consistent flow of resources to the state granaries. The poll tax, on the other hand, was levied per adult male, and typically paid in cloth or coin. It was, in essence, a way of ensuring that even those with little land contributed something to the imperial coffers. But taxation was not limited to material goods. The Han continued the Qin tradition of corvée labor, a requirement that each adult male provide a set number of days each year in service to the state. This might involve road repair, canal digging, military conscription, or work in government warehouses. For many peasants, this labor tax was more burdensome than the grain or cloth itself, particularly if one's family could not spare a worker during planting or harvest season. And yet, it was non-negotiable. The empire ran on this invisible workforce, toiling not for glory, but for infrastructure. Still, the Han administration was not without nuance. It recognized, occasionally, that context mattered. Natural disasters, bad harvests, and local unrest sometimes prompted temporary tax reliefs. In such cases, local magistrates would submit reports, lengthy, apologetic, filled with weather data and field surveys, requesting partial forgiveness of quotas. The central court would then review the request, dispatch inspectors if necessary, and issue a decision. These inspections were slow, bureaucratic affairs involving travel, meals, cross-examinations, and, always, more paperwork. Yet in a strange way, this ponderous process was its own kind of stability. Han governance was not swift, but it was consistent. A farmer might grumble about taxes, but he could reasonably expect that next year's would be similar. There was no surprise levy, no dramatic shift. And that predictability, when compared to the arbitrary tribute demands of earlier centuries, was deeply reassuring. Over time, the Han system grew more elaborate. Additional taxes were introduced on certain goods and professions, salt, iron, alcohol, particularly under the powerful Emperor Wu. These state monopolies allowed the government to collect revenue directly from key industries, reducing its dependence on agrarian taxes. The administration of these monopolies required, of course, a new layer of bureaucracy: inspectors, accountants, warehouse managers, logistics officers, and more clerks than anyone could really keep track of. The clerks, incidentally, were everywhere. In city offices, temple storehouses, frontier garrisons. They copied, counted, filed, and verified. They wrote in small, careful script on long rolls of bamboo, tied together with cord and sealed with lacquer. They handled census rolls, tax receipts, draft notices, supply lists, border reports, and disciplinary records. Most of their work was utterly boring. But utterly necessary. Confucian scholars, now elevated to positions of influence, praised these bureaucrats not for their creativity, but for their reliability. A good official, the Confucian texts explained, was one who knew his place, fulfilled his role, and kept accurate records. The highest praise was not genius, but diligence. It was an age in which the dull man with good handwriting could rise quite far. Of course, not all was smooth. The Han, like all empires, struggled with corruption. Officials inflated headcounts to skim surplus taxes. Local elites manipulated land records to reduce their dues. Inspectors were bribed, registries forged, grain shipments watered down. These crimes were investigated, sometimes, but the machinery of the state was too vast to monitor completely. The central government tried to keep pace, issuing edicts, rotating appointments, conducting surprise audits. But cheating was endemic. Quiet. Expected. Still, the system endured. Because beneath the fraud, the essential structure worked. Fields were planted, taxes collected, roads maintained. Most people paid enough. Most officials stole only a little. And when the books balanced, more or less, the court was content. By the 1st century CE, Han China had become a model of bureaucratic empire. Its officials were trained, if not always virtuous. Its tax system was predictable, if not entirely fair. Its records were massive, if not entirely accurate. And its people, while often weary, were accustomed to the rhythms of rule. There were even attempts at reform. Wang Mang, a usurper who briefly interrupted the Han line, tried to nationalize land and redistribute wealth. He issued new coinage, adjusted taxes, and implemented radical economic experiments. But his policies were unpopular, confusing, and short-lived. When the Han was restored, most of his reforms were quietly reversed. The old system, however flawed, was more familiar. Later Han rulers made smaller adjustments, sometimes lightening taxes during unrest, sometimes increasing corvée demands to fund campaigns or fortifications. But the basic tax structure of the Han remained remarkably consistent for 4 centuries. And while the dynasty eventually fell, slowly, painfully, under the weight of rebellion and regionalism, its model of governance did not. In fact, future dynasties would look back on the Han as the gold standard. Their tax codes, bureaucratic organization, and administrative divisions became templates for centuries to come. It was the Han who divided the empire into commanderies and counties, who defined the responsibilities of village elders and district magistrates, who institutionalized the relationship between state and subject. The Qin had imposed a system. The Han made it livable. And so, the Han dynasty gave China a kind of bureaucratic normalcy. A tax system that was neither too harsh nor too lax. A record-keeping structure that was neither revolutionary nor stagnant. A government that, despite its flaws, generally functioned. Not because of visionary leaders or grand policies, but because of quiet men with brushes and time. Let us imagine one such man. A tax clerk in the province of Shu, nestled among bamboo groves and riverbanks. He rises early. Eats rice with pickled mustard greens. Walks to the local office, where he unrolls his scrolls, checks the previous month's figures, and begins his day. His handwriting is steady. His math is slow but accurate. At midday, he pauses to drink tea, then returns to the table. Outside, peasants carry baskets of grain to the way station. Their names are known. Their fields recorded. The sun sets. The clerk ties up the day's documents and walks home. He is not remembered in history. But without him, history does not happen. This is the quiet engine of empire. 1,000 days like this. 1,000,000 numbers, written by hand, reviewed by candlelight. Grain measured. People counted. Roads maintained. Scribes aging, ink drying, registers expanding. Slowly. Predictably. Comfortably. And that, in the end, is the strange achievement of the Han dynasty. Not glory, but endurance. Not brilliance, but consistency. A bureaucracy not feared, like the Qins, but tolerated. Trusted, even. A tax code not inspiring, but accepted. It is, perhaps, the most boring accomplishment in all of Chinese history. And possibly, the most important. History, as it's often written, tends to favor the top. Emperors, officials, reformers with strong opinions and stronger handwriting, these are the ones whose names endure. But beneath them, silent and mostly anonymous, lived the people who actually kept the empire going. Not through command, but through labor. Not by decree, but by compliance. And among these millions upon millions of imperial citizens, no one bore the weight of the state more directly, more daily, or more wearily, than the peasant. The Chinese peasant, throughout the long scroll of imperial history, was many things: farmer, husband, mother, tax subject, soldier, builder, debtor, and sometimes, if conditions conspired just so, rebel. But more than anything, the peasant was a participant, willing or not, in a grand project of agricultural arithmetic. An arithmetic managed far above their head, but enacted squarely on their back. Let us begin, slowly, in the fields. The rhythm of a peasant's life was tied to the soil, and to the seasons. Spring was for planting, summer for weeding, autumn for harvest, and winter, well, winter was when the tax came due. This was not accidental. The state, over centuries, learned to wait. It was no use collecting tax before the harvest. People had nothing. Better to wait until the grain was safely in, dried, stored, and then arrive, brush in hand, scales in tow, and a calm, practiced expectation in the voice, now, if you would, the state's portion. The amount varied by dynasty, by region, and by time. In some periods, it was a flat rate, say, 1/15 of the annual yield. In others, it was proportionate to land ownership or family size. And in still others, it was flexible, depending on weather, war, or whim. But however the system shifted, the experience on the ground was mostly the same. After planting, tending, harvesting, threshing, drying, storing, and guarding your crop, a portion of it, often the best portion, would be packed up, hauled away, and handed over to an official who did not help grow it. This transaction was rarely dramatic. No imperial fanfare. No gleaming soldiers. Just a clerk, a scale, and the quiet understanding that this was how things worked. Some peasants paid in person at collection posts. Others were visited by itinerant tax gatherers, who arrived with a donkey cart and a few assistants. In either case, there was paperwork. Or more precisely, slip work, bamboo slips, later paper receipts. A small mark to say that the grain was delivered, the tax paid, and the state, for now, satisfied. Of course, this was only part of the burden. There was also the labor tax, corvée. A set number of days, usually around 30 per year, though this too varied, in which a working-age male was required to leave his field and work for the empire. This might mean hauling stone for a canal, repairing roads, garrisoning a distant border, or doing some other thing that had nothing to do with rice. For wealthier households, this service could sometimes be avoided, by sending a paid replacement, or paying an extra fee. But for most, the requirement was personal. You went. Or you faced punishment. And so, a farmer would plant his fields in spring, weed them in summer, try to avoid floods or drought, harvest in autumn, and then, just as the cold crept in and work slowed, he would be summoned to carry timber in some distant construction zone for a month. His family, meanwhile, would stretch their stores thin, waiting for his return. If he returned. For illness, injury, or simple misfortune often accompanied these journeys. This constant tug, between field and state, defined the peasant's life. He did not resist it, exactly. Resistance required energy, time, and a clear target. But he did not love it either. It was simply there, like weather. You adjusted. Some years were better than others. In years of good rain and good yield, the tax might feel manageable. In lean years, it felt cruel. But it never went away. To understand the peasant's burden, we must also consider his tools. Or lack thereof. The average Chinese farmer, for most of imperial history, worked with remarkably basic equipment. A plow, if lucky. A hoe, more likely. A basket, a sickle, a spindle. Fertilizer, when available, was often manure. Irrigation varied wildly, some regions had advanced canals, others relied on hopeful clouds. The yield per acre was modest. The margin between survival and failure was thin. And into this delicate balance came the tax, regular as frost. If the harvest failed, the tax still came. If a flood destroyed the fields, the tax still came. Sometimes, the state relented, issuing relief, delaying collection, or reducing quotas. But this required bureaucratic sympathy, which was not always forthcoming. More often, the village elders would negotiate, plead, stall. And occasionally, fudge the numbers. For there were tricks. Quiet ones. A farmer might underreport his acreage. A village might rotate names in the registry, spreading labor obligations more thinly than officially allowed. A tax official might overlook a missing sheaf in exchange for a chicken. These small negotiations, undeclared, unrecorded, formed the unofficial tax system. Not written in bamboo, but in looks, in nods, in years of shared understanding. Still, not all peasants were equal. Wealth mattered. Some families had larger holdings, better tools, hired help. Others scraped by on tiny plots. A drought that was inconvenient for one might be ruinous for another. And those on the edge, marginal land, no livestock, a sick child, lived in permanent tension. For them, the tax could not be paid. And so debt crept in. Tax arrears were dangerous. They led to land confiscation, indentured labor, or worse, punishment that compounded the inability to pay. Some peasants mortgaged their land. Others sold their children. Some fled entirely, slipping into the woods or the hills, becoming vagrants, or bandits, or rebels, depending on who was asking. And yet, most stayed. Most endured. They found ways to stretch grain, to barter, to pool labor. They married young, bore many children, buried many children, and kept going. For the alternative, rootlessness, lawlessness, was worse. The tax, even at its most demanding, offered predictability. A framework. A strange sort of peace. Let us pause, for a moment, and imagine a village. It is late autumn. The rice has been harvested, bundled, and stacked beneath thatch. The air smells of chaff and wood smoke. A government clerk arrives, riding a tired mule, scrolls tucked under his arm. He speaks with the village headman, checks the register, and sits beneath a mulberry tree. One by one, households come forward. They carry baskets. Weigh them. Write names. A child sneezes. A rooster complains. The clerk stamps a slip. The grain is loaded onto the cart. The peasant bows. And the year continues. No drama. No resistance. Just the unbroken rhythm of extraction. But sometimes, this rhythm broke. When tax demands became unbearable, due to war, disaster, or corruption, peasants rose. Slowly, at first. Quiet refusals. Delayed payments. Then meetings at night. Then weapons. Then slogans. The Yellow Turban Rebellion of the late Han period, for instance, was fueled not just by spiritual fervor, but by exhaustion. Too many taxes, too many demands, too little left. The rebellion was crushed, eventually. But the causes remained. Other dynasties learned from this. Some lightened the load. Others streamlined collection. But no dynasty ever abolished the tax. It was the price of empire. A price paid, always, by those closest to the soil. Over centuries, reforms came and went. The equal field system of the Tang dynasty redistributed land to balance obligations. The two-tax system simplified and consolidated. Later dynasties introduced household classifications, complex ledgers, even tax farming. But the basic structure never changed. Grain. Labor. Coin. People. Paper. And beneath it all, the peasant. He remained the constant. Dynasty to dynasty. Reform to reform. Always needed. Always measured. Never asked. It is tempting to pity him. And perhaps we should. But pity does not capture the full truth. For the peasant was not simply a victim. He was also resilient. He adapted. He carved meaning into routine. He raised families, passed down stories, built temples, sang songs. He participated, even when he did not choose to. And in doing so, he preserved the empire from below. His burden was never ending. But so was his endurance. So tonight, as we talk of tax codes and policies, let us remember the man who grew the millet. The woman who patched the clothes. The child who carried the bundles. The family who ate less so the quota could be met. Their names are gone. Their stories unwritten. But their labor, measured, counted, taxed, was the real foundation of China's greatness. Not the emperor. Not the scribe. But the peasant. The one who paid. By the time the Tang dynasty rose from the dust and ashes of fractured rule in the early 7th century, the idea of taxation in China had already been worn into the very grain of society. The peasantry expected it. The state depended on it. And the officials, well, they made careers from the dance of collecting, adjusting, reporting, and, increasingly, concealing it. The Tang would inherit all this, but, in keeping with their character, they would also refine it. For the Tang, ever elegant, ever structured, were not content merely to rule. They wished to rule with beauty, with order, with theory. And so the Tang tax system, especially in its early stages, was a model of balance, on paper, at least. Let us begin with a reform. One of the Tang's most celebrated early innovations was the equal field system, or Jun Tianji, a policy that sought to redistribute land not by whim or lineage, but by formula. Under this system, the state owned all land and allocated it to households based on the number of working adults and dependents. A man received a fixed amount of land to farm, a smaller plot for planting mulberries, which fed silkworms, and the understanding that, eventually, it would all revert to the state. It was, in theory, a system of fairness. No more sprawling estates for aristocrats who never touched a hoe. No more landless peasants eking out a living on borrowed soil. Each man had what he needed. Each man owed what he could bear. Taxes, under this system, were also restructured, no longer based solely on what one had, but on what one had been given. It was an elegant cycle. The state granted land. The citizen worked it. A portion returned to the state in the form of grain, cloth, and labor. This system came with its own tidy name, the Zhu Yongjiao tax structure. Zhu referred to the tax in kind, mainly grain, paid annually based on land allotment. Yong was the labor tax, a required corvée of around 20 days per year. And Jiao was the cloth tax, a tribute of woven fabric or silk thread that substituted for certain goods. Each tax had its place, each its schedule. Officials carried forms pre-printed with expectations. Villagers knew what to offer, when, and how. In this structured ballet, the empire breathed with a rhythm. Households were registered. Land was assigned. Quotas were calculated. Cloth was dyed. Fields were sown. Scrolls were copied. And carts, creaking under grain sacks and bolts of fabric, rolled toward district centers with a familiarity that dulled the sting of surrender. But behind this choreography, as with most things in history, was the more complicated truth. The equal field system, despite its name, was never truly equal. It relied on accurate household registers, regular land surveys, and cooperative local officials, all things that, in practice, proved deeply unstable. Families aged. Sons married. Land was tilled more, or less. Fields flooded, eroded, or expanded by secret agreement. And local officials, overworked, underpaid, and occasionally disinterested in purity, often found it easier to fudge the numbers than to argue with stubborn villagers. Gradually, the land grants became hereditary. Families passed their allotments down through generations, claiming continuity, forgetting to report deaths. Some merged plots. Others invented dependents to justify more land. A clever household could stretch a basic entitlement into something quite substantial, if they had a cooperative clerk nearby. Meanwhile, the state's ability to monitor this sprawling organism began to fray. Early Tang emperors had dispatched inspection teams, sent edicts, issued threats. But over time, as court politics grew tangled and officials more numerous, enforcement became, how shall we say, negotiable. And then came wealth. Trade boomed under the Tang. Markets flourished. Cities swelled. Silk and porcelain flowed out along the Silk Road, and silver came back in. A class of merchants and landowners began to grow, not from noble blood, but from successful ledgers. They bought land. They hired laborers. They, politely, declined to participate in the equal field charade. These elites had money, connections, and, most importantly, lawyers. Or at least, men who knew how to write letters filled with obscure references to previous edicts and interpretive precedents. They began acquiring permanent title to land, claiming exemptions based on special status or local decree. And gradually, much of the empire's best farmland slipped from the rotating logic of redistribution into the firm grip of private ownership. And as land grew unequal again, so did the taxes. Wealthy estates, employing tenant farmers and rotating seasonal workers, often negotiated their tax burdens downward. Some paid in coin. Others bribed officials for favorable assessments. And many, shielded by personal relationships or sheer distance from the capital, simply underreported. A clever landlord could, with sufficient finesse, appear to be a modest landholder, operating a few fields with his cousins, when in fact he was collecting rent from 24 families spread across 3 valleys. And yet the grain still arrived. The state continued to function. Why? Because someone still paid. And that someone was, as always, the smallholder. The peasant who couldn't negotiate. The household that was too honest, or too visible, to underreport. For every large estate evading tax, a dozen small farmers bore a slightly larger burden. The quotas did not shrink. They simply shifted. Let us imagine, for a moment, a county tax office in the year 732. It is spring. The new registers are being copied. An official, sleepless, ink-stained, reads through the lists, 412 households registered. 2,096 mouths. But only 172 have paid the jiao in full. Grain collections are light. The cloth tally is behind. The official sighs. Outside, villagers wait, their faces wary. A clerk proposes a temporary adjustment. The tax must be collected, but from whom? After all, the estate on the hill claims temporary hardship and a missing deed. Better to raise the quota on the others, just a bit. Most will pay. They always do. And so, the elegant system creaks. It did not collapse. Not immediately. Not even loudly. But the Tang tax system, so rational in design, began to wobble under the weight of its own idealism. Land concentration increased. The registry grew inaccurate. Families disappeared from the rolls. Some moved. Some hid. Some invented second identities to split obligations. Officials responded by drafting more forms. More categories. More policies. And all the while, corruption grew. Not as crime, but as custom. An extra fee here. A delayed report there. A nephew's name added to the list of exempted workers. A load of grain, dampened just slightly with river water to stretch the weight. These were not scandals. They were traditions. Even among high officials, the game continued. Governors inflated yields to earn praise. Inspectors looked the other way in exchange for silk robes. Some built private fortunes. Others built temples. Most built nothing, except the illusion that the system was still functioning as designed. And yet, it must be said, the Tang continued. For nearly 3 centuries, it governed, taxed, and ruled with a mixture of grace and grit. Roads were paved. Canals dug. Universities founded. Poets wrote. Monks traveled. The empire, though flawed, was alive. Because even corrupted systems can endure, if the people beneath them adapt. And the Chinese peasantry, seasoned, stoic, inventive, adapted endlessly. They formed cooperatives. Rotated field use. Hid grain. Shared tools. Offered bribes in rice, in duck, in silence. They learned which official was fair, which clerk preferred liquor, and which tax collector could be distracted with poetry. And thus, the elegant system lived on, not in purity, but in practice. Not in theory, but in workaround. It became, as most large systems eventually do, a game of performance. A farmer performed compliance. An official performed enforcement. And both walked away, knowing the game had been played well enough. Until, of course, it wasn't. As the Tang moved into its later years, internal rebellions, border crises, and economic strain began to crack the facade. The Inlushan Rebellion, in particular, devastated central authority. Millions died. Registers burned. Tax systems collapsed. For a time, the state could no longer collect. Not because people wouldn't pay, but because the system to receive it was gone. In the aftermath, the government introduced the two-tax system in 780, a major shift that finally acknowledged what had long been true: the equal field system was dead. Land was no longer equal. Households could no longer be counted reliably. The state would now tax households twice a year, based on their real wealth, as best as officials could estimate it. It was simpler, more flexible, and, frankly, easier to fudge. The elegance was gone. But so too was the pretense. And so the Tang, having once dreamed of a perfectly balanced state, settled instead for one that mostly worked. A dynasty that began with ideals of symmetry ended with systems of negotiation. And in this transition, we find perhaps the truest nature of tax in ancient China, not as a fixed rule, but a shifting relationship. Between empire and village. Between ruler and subject. Between grain and promise. The Tang tax system was, in the end, both brilliant and flawed. It inspired imitation. It endured long enough to shape its successors. And though corruption wormed through it like roots through stone, it never quite broke. Because in China, as always, the bureaucracy bends before it snaps. And the people, quietly, go on paying. By the time the Song dynasty rose to power in 960 CE, the idea of taxation in China was already as familiar to its citizens as the turning of seasons or the blooming of plum blossoms. It had become, for better or worse, a fact of life, like rice planting, rain, and the inevitability of aging. Yet the Song would bring something new to this ancient ritual. Not by softening the burden, nor by eliminating the quota, but by refining the process itself. For if previous dynasties taxed with ink and obligation, the Song would tax with innovation. Let us begin not with emperors or revolts, but with a sheet of paper. Not bamboo, not silk, but paper, woven from mulberry fibers, light in the hand, and wonderfully receptive to ink. This humble material, which had existed for centuries, came into its own under the Song. And with it came records, so many records. Land deeds, household registers, merchant inventories, salt licenses, tax receipts, and shipping manifests. Where the Tang scribbled, the Song copied. Where the Han filed, the Song archived. It was, in every sense, the age of documentation. The Song government, particularly during the Northern Song period, was deeply invested in knowing things. Census numbers. Crop yields. Merchant wealth. Guild membership. It was a state that believed, deeply, in the power of counting. And so it hired more clerks, trained more exam takers, and filled more rooms with files than any dynasty before it. But this knowledge wasn't for curiosity alone. It served a purpose: taxation. And to tax effectively, the Song knew, required accuracy. Not vague estimates or ritualized quotas, but detailed, localized, seasonally adjusted figures. They wanted to know, truly know, how much millet grew in Hebei, how many looms operated in Hangzhou, and how many pigs were being raised in the hills near Chengdu. Not because they wanted pigs. But because pigs, like all things, could be taxed. At the heart of this information web was the double taxation system inherited from the Tang. Refined, streamlined, and rebranded in the Song, it asked households to pay taxes twice a year, once in summer, once in autumn, based not on a fixed land grant, but on actual assets, land, property, occupation, and productivity. This required, as one might imagine, a great deal of surveying. And surveying required paperwork. Officials visited households with questionnaires. Not always literal questions, but lists: how many mu of land? How many adult males? How many oxen? How many mulberry trees? How many rooms in your house? Are you a weaver, a farmer, a salt seller, or a person who pretends to be poor? These inquiries were recorded, reviewed, and sent upward, forming a great bureaucratic tide that crested, eventually, at the capital in Kaifeng. Kaifeng, at its peak, was a marvel, a city of canals, bookstores, tax offices, printing houses, and restaurants. And here, amid the bustle, tax records were not only processed but preserved. Some were copied by hand. Others were block printed. The government had learned that handwriting was a weak link. Too many mistakes. Too many flourishes. Too many loopholes introduced by a stroke of the brush. And so they turned, whenever possible, to woodblock printing. Tax notices, licenses, and even ledgers were printed in uniform type, clear, legible, and difficult to embellish. Of course, that didn't stop people from trying. Even with innovation, evasion remained a national pastime. Merchants claimed losses. Farmers claimed floods. Officials claimed nothing, except bribes. And the state, for all its cleverness, was constantly racing against the creativity of its own subjects. Still, the Song had tools. In particular, they had the Baojia system, a neighborhood-based registration program that grouped households into clusters of 10, then 10 clusters into 100. Each cluster had a head, responsible for reporting changes in residence, death, or taxable activity. It was a form of communal surveillance. Your neighbor knew your debts. Your cousin knew your livestock. And if you tried to hide a new pig pen, someone would mention it, especially if they didn't like you. The system wasn't perfect. Many heads of household refused the responsibility. Some reported dishonestly. Others vanished into the countryside. But in urban areas, especially, it created a social mesh that made tax evasion slightly more difficult, and collective guilt slightly more motivating. And so the records grew. The Song taxed land, yes, but also professions. There were levies on merchants, artisans, tea growers, and salt producers. Boat licenses. Market fees. Bridge tolls. Wine taxes. Urban business permits. Some payments were made in coin, others in cloth or grain, still others in salt or oil or simply time. Every sector of society, except the very poorest, was drawn into the imperial spreadsheet. And what a spreadsheet it was! Officials began dividing regions not only by province or county, but by production capacity. There were special tax zones. Commodity districts. Trade corridors. Areas of strategic significance, ports, mining towns, shipping lanes, were mapped and taxed accordingly. To support this complex apparatus, the Song developed financial bureaus with overlapping jurisdictions. The 3 departments and 6 ministries model matured into a vast, layered structure. There were ministries for revenue, works, rights, war, justice, and personnel. Each had sub-bureaus. Each sub-bureau had clerks. And each clerk had a scroll. But even that was not enough. As trade grew, so did the need for liquid currency. And here, the Song introduced perhaps their most ambitious innovation, paper money. Known as jiaozi, it was originally issued by private merchants in Sichuan, then adopted by the state. These notes, printed on thick paper, bore official seals and expiration dates. They could be exchanged, stored, and, most importantly, taxed. The state began accepting them for certain fees. And while inflation would eventually follow, the principle remained: taxes were no longer tied only to what you grew, but to what you held. This marked a shift. The empire was moving from subsistence to economy. From tax in kind to tax in abstraction. A farmer paid in grain. A merchant paid in currency. A landlord paid in rents. And a government accountant, sitting at his desk beneath a swaying lantern, calculated equivalencies between them all. It was beautiful. And maddening. For every innovation that simplified one aspect of taxation, another complexity emerged. New forms required new rules. New abuses prompted new policies. And somewhere, always, a clerk muttered to himself in candlelight, correcting a misfiled record from 3 counties over. The volume of documentation became, in time, a burden. Some offices stored thousands of scrolls. Records grew faster than they could be read. Filing systems collapsed. Dust settled. Officials learned to cite older documents vaguely, as per the spring register of the 3rd year of Shang, without actually checking it. A report misfiled was a report forgotten. And yet, the system persisted. Because even when imperfect, it functioned. Taxes arrived. Roads were maintained. Armies fed. The government, bloated though it was, retained its shape. And the people, tired though they were, retained their rhythm. The peasant, of course, still bore the greatest weight. For all the clever innovations, his obligations remained heavy. He now dealt not only with local officials, but with abstracted quotas calculated from distant bureaus. He navigated new forms, new definitions of land usage, and sometimes, new currencies. A clever farmer might prosper. But a confused one might default. And confusion, under the song, was rarely in short supply. Still, some found opportunity. Artisans, for instance, organized into guilds, which negotiated tax obligations collectively. Merchants developed systems of credit and partnership to spread risk. Even some peasants began forming cooperatives, shared labor pools, collective ownership, rotating savings. They were not resistance movements, but adaptations. For the song world was one of adjustment. Taxation was no longer a flat decree, but a dialogue, between state and subject, between innovation and habit, between ambition and fatigue. It is fitting, perhaps, that so much of the song legacy survives not in monuments, but in documents. In ledgers, receipts, maps, surveys, letters, and lists. They are not glamorous. But they are precise. And in their precision, we glimpse a state that tried, earnestly, if imperfectly, to understand itself. Let us end with a quiet scene. An accountant in the year 1112 sits in an office in linen, pen poised over a sheet of printed paper. Outside, rain falls gently. In the corner, a junior clerk boils tea. A stack of forms awaits review, some tax notices, some trade licenses, one strange report from the salt commissioner. The accountant sighs. He begins copying a figure, 9,412 bolts of cloth expected from the southern district. His brush moves slowly. Carefully. Line by line. The tea steams. The rain continues. The empire breathes. Not with triumph. But with calculation. By the time the Shang dynasty fell in 1279, after a long and mostly polite resistance to Mongol encroachment, China had already become a civilization defined by its numbers. Not the numbers of poetry or astronomy, but the quieter ones, of households, acreage, livestock, labor days, bolts of cloth, sacks of millet, and, above all, tax quotas. And when the Yuan dynasty took the stage, riding in not on theory but on horses, they found this architecture of arithmetic already in place. The Mongols had not conquered China to become tax collectors. And yet, like so many conquerors before them, they quickly realized that there are only so many ways to govern a settled, agrarian population of tens of millions. You can raid, certainly. But eventually, if you wish to stay, you must count. You must assign quotas. You must build a tax system. And the Mongols, to their own surprise perhaps, found themselves doing precisely that. The Yuan dynasty, established by Kublai Khan, was in many ways an odd fusion, Mongol in origin, Chinese in administration, Persian in accounting, and Buddhist in ritual. It had steppe sensibilities but bureaucratic ambitions. Its rulers may have preferred tents and meat, but their officials sat behind desks, wrote in Chinese script, and balanced ledgers in rooms filled with quiet scribbling. From the start, the Yuan court understood that it needed revenue. The empire was vast, stretching from Korea to parts of Eastern Europe, but it was China, with its wealth of fields and people, that formed the heart of the treasury. And so, Kublai and his advisors looked not to the saddlebag but to the registry. They began, reasonably enough, by trying to understand what they had. This was harder than expected. The long years of warfare had disrupted many of the household registers. Fields had been abandoned. Villages depopulated. Entire provinces were filled with people who did not exist, on paper, and others who existed only on paper. The old Shang bureaucrats had fled, died, or been absorbed into the new regime. It took years for the Yuan administration to assemble a functioning census. And even when assembled, it was not always believed. Still, the basic tax structure re-emerged. Peasants were expected to provide grain. Artisans provided goods. Merchants, taxed with special vigor under the Mongols, provided silver. Labor obligations were revived, and in some places expanded. The corvée, known under various names, became a major source of state labor. Road crews, construction teams, and imperial couriers all drew from this conscripted pool. But what made the Yuan system particularly distinctive was its obsession with categories. The Mongols divided the population into a hierarchy of ethnic classes. At the top, the Mongols themselves; below them, the Simu, or various colored eyes, primarily Central Asians; then the Hanren, Northern Chinese; and finally the Nanren or Manzi, Southern Chinese, the former Song subjects. Tax rates and labor obligations were adjusted accordingly. It was, perhaps, the first time in Chinese history that taxation was overtly racialized, codified in law. Unsurprisingly, this bred resentment. Southern Chinese bore the brunt of tax burdens. Mongols were often exempt. And the administrative class, largely composed of Simu and newly recruited northern elites, developed a reputation for corruption, detachment, and, often, inaccuracy. Still, the bureaucracy operated. Not smoothly, not elegantly, but persistently. Land was surveyed. Grain collected. Roads patrolled. The Yuan even attempted a kind of proto-national accounting system, issuing paper currency in unprecedented volumes, chow, printed on mulberry bark paper, backed by state grain reserves and, eventually, by sheer imperial insistence. This was not a success. The overprinting of money, combined with inconsistent taxation and rampant speculation, led to inflation on a grand scale. Prices rose. Confidence eroded. And eventually, even government officials preferred to be paid in kind, or in silver, or not at all. But not all was mismanaged. One particular contribution of the Yuan was the consolidation of tax geography. The empire was divided into Lu, Fu, and Xian, a system of provinces, prefectures, and counties that aligned tax responsibilities with population clusters. Registers became more localized. And while the results varied, the principle was sound: tax not from the center out, but from the bottom up. Still, the cracks widened. Rebellions multiplied. Natural disasters, famines, floods, disrupted the already fragile grain economy. And the state, increasingly desperate for revenue, leaned harder on those who had least. The taxes did not decline. The confidence did. And so, after just under a century, the Yuan faded. In their place rose the Ming, founded by a man who had once been a peasant, who had labored in fields, begged for food, and seen firsthand the consequences of imperial extraction. Zhu Yuanzhang, later the Hongwu emperor, came to power in 1368. He had no patience for Mongol decadence, no love for elite manipulation, and absolutely no tolerance for bureaucratic ambiguity. His reign was, from the start, a campaign of control. And his primary weapon was not the sword, but the ledger. The Hongwu emperor set out to reform the tax system with the zeal of someone who had once paid too much tax himself. He distrusted officials. He distrusted merchants. He distrusted almost everyone except peasants, and even them, not entirely. His solution was a massive census. In the early years of the Ming, a nationwide population and land survey was launched. It sought to count every person, measure every field, record every tree, and, ideally, fix taxation once and for all. The result was the Yellow Registers, brightly dyed documents containing meticulous records of households, their members, landholdings, property, and obligations. These were compiled and stored at multiple administrative levels, with backup copies to prevent tampering. Land, in particular, was mapped and measured with new intensity. Local magistrates were ordered to produce fish scale maps, named for their overlapping field plots, resembling fish scales, each field drawn, labeled, and tied to an owner. It was, at least on paper, an extraordinary exercise in fiscal clarity. Taxes were then assessed in a new format, a single whip system, simplified and streamlined, combining multiple previous taxes into one. Instead of paying grain, cloth, labor, and other miscellaneous levies, households were required to deliver a single, annual quota, usually in grain, sometimes in silver. The goal was consistency. And for a time, it worked. Grain flowed into storehouses. Officials were monitored. Land ownership stabilized. The Ming, suspicious of bureaucracy, implemented rotating postings and severe punishments for corruption. The empire hummed, not gently, not smoothly, but solidly. But over time, the system began to ossify. The registers were rarely updated. The yellow registers that had once reflected population reality became documents of fantasy, recording the children of dead men, the land of eroded fields, the obligations of vanished households. And because the quotas were tied to these aging records, some villages were taxed for people who no longer existed. Meanwhile, the real population grew. Land changed hands. People moved, legally or otherwise. But the state clung to its 14th century numbers. To revise them would require another great census. And no one had the appetite. And so the people adapted. Families learned how to split households to reduce tax burdens. Some bribed officials to misrecord land transfers. Others joined growing bands of Ming-ben, landless, registry-free workers who existed outside official count. Their numbers grew. The tax base, once solid, began to hollow. Silver also changed the equation. By the late Ming period, the Chinese economy had begun shifting toward a silver-based system. Trade with Japan and the Americas brought in vast quantities of silver bullion, and the state, recognizing its liquidity, began accepting silver in place of grain. This seemed efficient. But it introduced volatility. Silver prices fluctuated. Poor peasants, who once paid in grain they grew, now had to sell grain to buy silver. In years of bad harvest, they couldn't. And as silver drained from the countryside into elite hands, tax burdens once again tilted downward. The result was slow crisis. Not dramatic collapse. Just quiet exhaustion. Storehouses emptied. Officials pleaded for leniency. Peasants fled. And the Ming, burdened by an outdated system and a population it could no longer see, began to wither. The fall came, eventually, as it often does, not from tax policy alone, but from the accumulation of many small misalignments. But taxation was there, in every corner of the story. It was there in the peasant who paid in silver he didn't have. It was there in the official who inflated the registry to earn a promotion. It was there in the warehouse where the grain rotted, and in the scroll where it still appeared as delivered. It was there in the mathematics, elegant, endless, that no longer matched the lives they were meant to measure. And so the Ming, despite its arithmetic, was overtaken. But the records remained. Filed. Stored. Forgotten. Waiting, perhaps, for a dynasty that would count things all over again. By now, we've spent some considerable time, perhaps more than anyone should, gently walking through the bureaucratic corridors of ancient Chinese taxation. We've visited dynasties and discussed forms, quotas, ledgers, and receipts. We've peered over the shoulders of tired clerks and sighed alongside reluctant peasants. But the history of taxation, like the taxes themselves, was never confined solely to paper. Beyond the numerical logic, beneath the careful brushstrokes and stamped seals, there lived something deeper. Something harder to count, and harder to erase. For even in a world built on measurements, the human mind continued to fill in the margins, with meaning, with metaphor, and, more often than one might think, with dread. Let us now, slowly, shift our attention away from the accountants and the forms. Let us move instead into the cultural landscape, the stories, fears, superstitions, and rituals that bloomed around the quiet inevitability of tax. Because while the imperial system saw tax as an instrument of order, the people who paid it often saw it as something else entirely. The word for tax in Chinese, shui, was never neutral. It carried weight. Not just in syllables, but in sentiment. It was spoken softly, cautiously, and often accompanied by a small shake of the head or a bitter sigh. It did not inspire pride, or loyalty, or joy. It inspired endurance. It was the shadow in the wheat, the hidden hand in the harvest. And although it did not always arrive with violence, it almost always arrived with anxiety. This fear, though rarely expressed outright in records or edicts, seeped into the culture. It emerged in folk tales, in ghost stories, in poems and plays and whispered warnings. The tax collector, in popular imagination, was not merely a man with a brush. He was, depending on the region, a trickster, a predator, or a kind of secular grim reaper. His visit did not herald death, but it often brought suffering. A reduction in stores. A child sent to labor. A father absent for corvée. A marriage delayed. A debt taken. It was common, especially in rural villages, for tax days to be accompanied by subtle rituals. Offerings made not to officials, but to ancestors. A hope that the spirits of the family, unseen but ever present, might intercede. Might soften the mood of the official. Might ensure the rice was dry enough. Might prevent the clerk from noticing the new ox, hidden behind the neighbor's barn. In some regions, tax days were considered inauspicious for other activities. Marriages were postponed. Travel delayed. Temples avoided. There was a kind of cultural stillness on these days, a recognition that something was happening, even if it was not spoken of loudly. It was a day when numbers changed, and when lives, however subtly, tilted. And then there were the dreams. Throughout dynastic history, dream manuals and household almanacs included curious entries regarding tax. To dream of a ledger was to be warned of obligations left unfulfilled. To dream of spilled grain foretold conflict with local officials. To dream of an empty barn was a call to prepare. These were not metaphors. They were tools, cultural mechanisms for interpreting a world in which fiscal pressure could arrive at any time, often with little warning, and never with kindness. The tax collector, as a figure, became a staple in local theater. In the Zaju dramas of the Yuan, or the Chuanqi plays of the Ming, he appeared not just as a minor character, but often as a villain. He was greedy, oily, self-important. He took more than he needed. He smiled too much. The audience knew the type. They laughed, uneasily. Because exaggeration is a kind of truth, and the theater has always been a place where power is named in jest. But not all portrayals were comic. In some ghost stories, the tax collector was a spectral figure, a wandering soul doomed to eternally assess a village long since buried. In others, the overtaxed peasant returned from the grave to confront the official who had ruined his family. These stories were rarely about justice. More often, they were about imbalance. About a world in which numbers had forgotten the people they measured. The symbolism of tax also crept into religion. In Taoist cosmology, there were spiritual officials, heavenly accountants, one might say, who recorded human deeds in ledgers. Good deeds and bad were tallied, and the balance determined one's fate. These cosmic tax records were believed to be consulted by the kitchen god, a household deity who reported annually to heaven. Before his departure, families would smear honey on his statue's mouth, encouraging him to speak sweetly of their actions. It was, in essence, a celestial bribe. A tax ritual in miniature. In Buddhist texts, too, karma was often framed in economic terms. Suffering as debt. Good deeds as credit. Rebirth as audit. The metaphor was compelling. It suggested that life, like governance, could be managed through balance sheets. But also that mistakes, once recorded, lingered. And so, even the divine began to feel bureaucratic. It is perhaps no surprise, then, that peasants feared more than tax collectors. They feared their ledgers. For while the man might be bribed, distracted, or delayed, the paper did not forget. It remembered who owed what. It remembered the missed year. The underreported field. The uncle who had once worked but now could not be found. The ledger was impersonal. Unyielding. Cold. And in that coldness, there was something chillingly modern. Because to be measured, to be reduced to a line item, was to be known, but not seen. It was to exist, but only partially. To be acknowledged by the state, but not understood. One's name, one's field, one's tax, this was the totality of recognition. Everything else, grief, illness, dreams, fears, was surplus. This sense of bureaucratic invisibility gave rise to a strange blend of loyalty and loathing. People respected the state. They depended on it for roads, safety, ritual, and continuity. But they also resented its blindness. Its refusal to see nuance. Its obsession with compliance over compassion. This duality appears in poems. A Tang dynasty verse speaks of a father returning from a tax corvée, aged, limping, with empty hands. The family rejoices, he is alive, but the next day he is called again. In a later Ming piece, a widow watches her son hauled off for labor, his only crime being that he grew tall enough to be counted. There is no outrage in these verses. Just tiredness. Even scholars, themselves part of the bureaucratic machine, often wrote with quiet frustration. Essays questioned the logic of taxing peasants after floods. Memorials suggested lighter quotas. Some dared to argue that measuring was not the same as knowing. Most were ignored. Yet the system endured. Because, in truth, it worked. Taxes built walls, funded armies, repaired canals, paid salaries. The empire was not built by violence alone. It was built, day by day, by ledgers. And people, even when afraid, participated. Because they had to. But also because there was comfort in the known. There was comfort in the cycle. In planting, growing, harvesting, and surrendering. In receiving a stamped receipt. In being marked as paid. It was, in a strange way, proof of belonging. To be taxed was to be part of the world. Even if one did not entirely trust it. And so, the symbolism of tax, over time, became one of contradiction. It represented burden, but also structure. Loss, but also order. It was feared, mocked, resisted, obeyed, negotiated. It was ritual, but also risk. An act of power, but also a cry for recognition. It was, in the end, profoundly human. And so, when we speak of ancient Chinese tax codes, let us not stop at the numbers. Let us look beyond the ledgers, into the faces of those who lived beneath them. Let us remember the woman who baked flatbread while her husband measured out grain for the official. The child who copied numbers he didn't understand. The clerk who watched the rain ruin the ink. The elder who told stories about a tax ghost who could count dreams. These are not records. But they are real. Because tax, like history, lives not in the books, but in the lives that filled them. And so, after drifting with deliberate softness through the scrolls and stories, forms and fields, offices and oxen of ancient China's long tax history, we arrive, without fanfare, without triumph, at the quiet conclusion. Not a grand finale, not a climactic uprising, but simply a long, drawn-out exhalation. Because the end of a story about taxation is rarely dramatic. It doesn't gallop. It doesn't roar. It settles. Like a layer of dust on a disused abacus. Like the last line in a well-balanced ledger. It is here, in this quiet, that we can finally begin to see the shape of something too large to notice while we were in it. The form of a civilization, not as a burst of conquest or a philosophical awakening, but as a slow and persistent act of counting. Measuring. Recording. Requiring. A civilization as a ledger, and its authors, the ones with the real power, not the generals or the poets or the dragon-robed emperors, but the ones who knew how to hold a brush. Not all heroes wear armor. Some wear ink stains. They are the ones who sat in silence for most of their working lives, hunched over bamboo slips and silk scrolls and later, stacks of coarse paper. They dipped their brushes in black and red, not for art, not for literature, but for balance. They didn't write for applause. They wrote to ensure that the numbers matched. These were the quiet architects of empires. For every imperial expansion, every rebuilt canal, every stable currency and bustling market, somewhere, there was a clerk. Often several. Often unpaid overtime. These were the people who, day after day, decided, without being noticed, how much millet a district owed, how many men would be conscripted for corvée, how much cloth was due from the spinners in the next town over, and how many coins a merchant would surrender after selling salt by the barrel. They did not raise armies. They fed them. They did not command farmers. They listed them. They did not build cities. But they ensured the bricks arrived on time. They lived and died in footnotes. But they were the backbone of a system so vast and so persistent that it outlasted dynasty after dynasty, emperor after emperor, flood after famine. And they were, in their way, deeply human. Because even as they wielded the full power of the state in a ledger line, they also knew, intimately, how fragile it all was. How a few bad harvests could unravel a village. How a miscalculated rate could bankrupt a family. How a lost register could send a household into bureaucratic purgatory, never again properly seen by the state. They knew the weight of their ink. But theirs was not a celebrated work. No statues were raised to tax accountants. No poems written for the registrar who double-checked the household count before a corvée levy. No festivals for the assistant scribe who quietly reduced a quota because he knew the family had lost their son that year. These gestures, small and unrecorded, shaped the actual contours of rule. They were the grease in the wheels. The whispered, "It's fine," behind the counter. The official who looked the other way when the grain was slightly underweight because he knew the village had been flooded 3 seasons in a row. They were also, of course, sometimes corrupt. Sometimes petty. Sometimes rigid. Bureaucracy attracts all kinds. But it also holds all kinds. It holds the state together. With forms, with stamps, with policy memos that take months to read and even longer to forget. And so the empire, so often thought of in maps, in borders, in dynasties, can also be imagined as a building. Not a palace. A low, square building with a slanted roof, filled with desks. Each desk occupied by a civil servant, bent over a scroll. Somewhere, someone is writing. Somewhere else, someone is calculating. And outside, people wait in line, scrolls in hand, ready to pay, to report, to comply. Not because they love the state. Not even because they fear it. But because this is what life is. You plant. You harvest. You pay. You repeat. There's a kind of comfort in that. And while this arrangement, over centuries, was adjusted, reformed, patched, rebranded, collapsed, rebuilt, and remeasured, its core logic never truly disappeared. The bureaucratic empire, the empire of registers and ratios, persisted through dynastic collapse, foreign conquest, ideological revolution. It survived not because it was glamorous, but because it worked. Not perfectly. Not even well. But reliably. And in history, reliability is a kind of power. It is the power of paper. Paper does not command armies. But it tells them where to go. It does not feed the people. But it remembers who has food. It does not rule. But it documents the ruler. It does not speak. But it cannot be unheard. And so, as dynasties wrote their names in bronze and blood, paper quietly watched, and remembered. The tax records of a rural province could outlast the emperor's tomb. A ledger could outlive a rebellion. A household registry, buried in a county archive, might re-emerge centuries later, the names still legible, even if the people who carried them are long returned to dust. We tend to think of history as great acts. Great people. But there is another history. One less visible. One not written by the victors, but by the scribes. A history not of battlefields, but of back rooms. Not of crowns, but of counters. A history of how much rice was grown, and how much was taken. A history of compliance, of work, of participation without celebration. It is a quieter history. But it is real. And this quietness, in some ways, is what makes it beautiful. Because in the slow, tedious accumulation of forms and files, of rates and receipts, we begin to see a mirror. Not of the empire alone, but of ourselves. We all live with systems. With schedules, reports, due dates, quotas. We fill out forms. We calculate taxes. We balance budgets. And in doing so, we participate in a kind of silent governance, not of laws, but of math. And we inherit the same fears, too. The fear of being overcounted. The fear of being forgotten. The fear that the paper says something untrue, and no one is listening. The fear that the number next to our name does not reflect the life we've lived. And, perhaps most deeply, the fear that the record matters more than the reality. But we also inherit the quiet dignity of those before us. The ability to navigate systems. To endure them. To whisper about them over dinner. To tell stories about unfair forms and wrong addresses. To laugh, gently, at bureaucracy, even as it holds our lives in a folder. And maybe, in this, we are not so different from the villagers of old. They lined up. They paid. They went home. They survived. And the scribes? They stayed late. Wrote one more line. Adjusted one more column. And then, quietly, went home too. So tonight, as we close this strange tale of tax codes and clerks, remember, empires are not just built by ambition. They are built by routine. By record. By habit. By people who do the same task, every day, until the world changes around them. The real architects of empire were not the ones who gave orders. They were the ones who kept the files. They were not known. But they were necessary. They were boring. But they were eternal. And somewhere, in a forgotten archive, their work still waits. Perfectly balanced.